Well, for some year 11s right now, involved in a UK type system, there are choices to be made about um, what you're going to be doing for A-level subjects, and then that obviously filters on to what you might be doing for a degree subject, and there's lots of sort of decisions to be made this time of year. Obviously, in some ways, you think, well, children are quite young to be making those decisions, or children and families and educators all together. And it's true, just that the world is structured like that at the moment. Obviously, with lots of Plan B options, doing different kind of masters, happenstance and adult education, all kinds of things are there to some extent now. But nevertheless, it's hoped that by the time young people are 16, they've got an idea of who they are and what courses would represent a good alignment between their interests and skills and, you know, what's actually available. So this is a call really from the heart that the subjects that used to form the basis of, I guess, what would be more of a classical education, such as literature and history, are not left off of, or left off of people's best thinking, really. We don't want them to end up on the cutting room floor of sort of educational or civilizations history, really. And this is partly a response to what you might call the STEM Juggernaut. So obviously now the most privileged sort of high status professions in, let's say, European countries, America, lots of contexts, also a lot of African contexts where I work, are doctor, accountant, lawyer. It's sort of like known as the Holy Trinity, isn't it? And you're trying to get, many parents will try and get their children into one of those subjects. And of those three, obviously, doctor and accountant tend towards a kind of maths and science A-level basis, whereas law, is a bit more flexible, and often universities don't even require a law A-level, but they want to see things where, critical thinking, textual synthesis, analysis has taken place. So obviously English, literature, language and history, A-levels have a role there, and that's something that's understood. But there's really a dematerialisation of English literature going on, it seems to me, in relation to English language. Whereas English language A-level seems sort of like pinnable to this idea of kind of like analysis. It's thought that literature is somehow too airy-fairy, or it's all to do with poetry, and it could be forgotten about, and like no one's really going to lose out, or what have you. Let's throw in, to some extent, art, modern foreign languages in some English dominant contexts, and other subjects like that. Where STEM and big data, let's say up until the point where AI was coming onto the scene, was kind of like, that's where essentially the jobs are, I think. That's where, if we want economic uplift for our children, we want them to join a professional sort of global class, then that's where they need to be. And I've got a child, so I relate to that. I don't want her to be unemployed or useless in the world's eyes. But nevertheless, anyone who's teacher, psychologist, sociologist, just an open-hearted person, people you just walked around with your eyes open thinking, who are these young people? What are they like? You've got a lot of, let's say, psyches, or you could even say souls out there who are not very well attuned to the world of STEM. So you ask them if they can sing or something like that, and they'll produce something angelic for you. You ask them to sort of like appreciate and respond to sort of like poetry, produce art, and they're there, and they plug into that creativity and that imagination. So when they're being themselves, and it comes through, it comes through in those subjects more than sort of like, let's say, something like in physics where you have a a formula, and you're sort of applying it, and you're reading kind of like one of those contextual questions and sort of like trying to match the formula elements and then kind of unpack it and work that out. There is a linguistic element to that, but they're not very well attuned to those things. Perhaps at this stage of life, I actually myself came to science much later, having done English and history, A-levels and psychology, and then doing a bit more kind of like English literature, undergrad, teacher training, postgrad in language education and language education politics. And so, I mean, I ended up with kind of like a mixed bag with quite a lot of social sciences thrown in. But I wasn't at all on the scientific side till I was about 40 years old, really. Could be to do with life circumstances or many things, but that's how it was for me. What we're going to do with these young people, though, who are just creative souls, I want to make sort of like 2 points about this. One is sort of like perhaps a slightly contemporary understanding of the sort of classical idea of personal development. Obviously, we're going to add a little bit of critical thinking in there, which, as we know, is something that universities, when universities argue, like, well, what are we really adding to young people because of how expensive courses are now, they often basically say, well, we're adding critical thinking, which is true. There might be other ways of doing it. I'm sure there are other ways of learning to drive than doing a driving test, but it's just like driving lessons. It's just like that's a pathway, it's there, it's real. And then the third point is to do with sort of like AI, which is really kind of like an unknown, to quote, to sort of like honour Donald Rumsfeld, or if you're old enough to remember that. But so the first point about classical education. So, as much as if you stare into the abyss stares into you. Thank you, Friedrich Nietzsche. If you stare into Tolstoy stares into you. If you stare into Winston Churchill's History of the Second World War, Churchill stares into you. Lao Tzu, if he was a real person, or if he was a placeholder for Chinese philosophy that emerged, you read the Tao Te Ching, it stares into you. Like, these texts have a trajectory of sort of like enabling you to think and sort of like be like the authors. So it's the same thing where a 12-year-old looks at a 15-year-old in the street and thinks, one day I'm going to be like you. If you read Dostoevsky, maybe one day you could be like him, So then I guess the question would be, is that desirable? But the point is that when you're dealing with the perception of someone like Tolstoy, he's able to describe to you a social world that's probably much more articulated than the one that you know. But what happens is you read him and you find there's a correspondence between Tolstoy's world and all of the parallels that, as you read through, you're amazed by, wow, but that's really is how it is, and although the society there was very, very different, we still see parallels and so on. And the mind of Tolstoy is something you won't forget. You read Anna Karenina, one of those books. I know, I'm bragging now. Or if you read War and Peace on the train or whatever, but it's totally unforgettable. Dostoevsky, Charles Dickens, the mind, like, there's something mysterious captured in the voice. So obviously within the text there's voice, right? So the writer's voice is encapsulated in there. We couldn't, without being too woo-woo about it, there's something of the experience, it feels like, of having a conversation, or at least listening directly to the voice of these great minds. So I'm sure, my best friend's wonderful. I'm sure yours is too. But Tolstoy was, after the printing press, was able to go all around the world. And that's equally, even more so, is true now, isn't it, with, social media and the internet. But to have such a distilled and kind of like prolonged vision in so much detail over time, where you see character development. So if you were to say, when's the last time someone sat down to you and explained to you the trajectory that your life could take through a number of choices and what the outcomes might be based on the decisions Anna Karenina made to leave her husband, for example? We might say actually Tolstoy's vision was a bit traditional there, but no one's ever sat down to me and talked that through in such incredible detail. You can have scare tactics like, oh, well, this you shouldn't do this, shouldn't do that. Tolstoy, lays out the whole thing for you in a way that no one else can really. So, I mean, for history, if you want to participate in the world as it is, if you want to understand what are quite real sort of socio-cultural sort of like layers that like we're walking through, you know, embodied sort of like belief systems in certain sections of society and where that comes from, sort of in a post-colonial context, you know, the very underwritten and undertold pre-colonial times, the colonial and then the post-colonial era. Again, you might not want to define it as something post-colonial because it still attaches it to the colonial. But nevertheless, if you don't really know that, so if you, say, grow up in a post-colonial context in an English language school, and you don't really know how it's come to be the case that you're speaking English and not a number of other local languages, you need to know that really. And then when you read the African writers, or the Indian writers, or you know, all the post-colonial writers, filling in sort of like they're laying their soul out in these texts, sort of explaining. I'm still trying to figure out like connecting up those three eras of sort of like my cultural inheritance, and the complexity of that, you know, is understood, can be understood historically, obviously, and in a literary way as well. So obviously, lawyers, politicians, social policy, NGO, educators, psychologists, like artists, content creators, of which there's a very large number. I mean, I don't know whether we'd include this video in that, but you know, it's sort of like without the historical perspective, even once you get to the postmodern level and you say, well, look, these are all just, you know, competing narratives, or often narratives like constructed by those who were victorious. Like the First World War is a good example of that, isn't it? Where even actually GCSE students will have to look at, you know, things like, was Germany really to blame for, you know, the First World War? And understanding that kind of like, oh, this is sort of like positions, things are included, excluded, you know, I don't know if we're still allowed to say postmodernism, but, you know, understanding history from that point of view was a starting point, really, perhaps in a more positive way, for understanding that there's a possibility for understanding multiple points of view and linking them up, and there's something inherently creative about that, you know, So, you know, if you want to pass through levels of intellectual development to the point where you're going to actually, you know, be able to speak for a number of different points of view at the same time, STEM's not going to do it. Like, I'm sorry. Of course, you could change it or do something else or make it so that STEM was more like that, but it won't do it. They're very highly siloed practices, and don't allow for the comparison of all these multiple sort of like viewpoints. So that's something that we have to face. That was point one, like classical education, but from like a modern like perspective. So what was the other point I was going to say? That was point one. I think possibly I've sort of like enrolled 2 points into one there. So then when you come on to AI and you think about, hold on a minute, well, what skills does anyone need sort of like in the new world anyway, the new world that we haven't yet seen? Because, you know, it's predicted that every sector will be disrupted. You know, is teacher bot going to replace teachers? Is doctor bot going to replace doctors? You know, psych bot, you know, what lawyer bot, you know, it's all going to go, is it? And then we really don't know what's going to happen at the moment. I mean, people have said, and I think I'm just really echoing that point of view, that one of the things that is harder to imagine AI having is sort of like an imaginative and creative response, a relevant, imaginative, creative, grounded response, taking in sort of like multiple viewpoints from a human perspective, having sort of like an emotional response to that, personal response, as a synthesis of like a number of things. And obviously AI can synthesize information with a linguistic nature, But the creative and imaginative response, I think we have to presume, is still sort of like the purview of the human race, really. It's sort of what we hope, really, that will stay. Number crunching things, we're not really going to be doing that. I mean, my research has been in applied linguistics, linguistic development. And some of the things we used to do with corpus linguistics is just on the verge now of being able to be done in 10 minutes, what used to take like 100 hours. As soon as you can go a little bit more back end and say, okay, give parameters to the corpus that you're responding to, strip out all of the punctuation or take away references or transfer proper nouns into some other class or blah, 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 blah. No, it still makes errors, but it won't in the next few years. And then, with a very good prompt, you'll be able to say, for argument's sake, what do first year med students with French and Chinese as their first language, what are the words that they misuse, in their undergraduate writing? like that's not going to be, obviously we need to know, that's a question that you might want to ask. But the actual work of it, will be very, very rapid. So sort of like instantaneous or near instantaneous sort of like solutions. But what is the type of intelligence is going to be able to create those prompts? And again, it's this sort of like multi-perspectival synthesis type mindset where you creatively imagine like a win-win situation for a whole bunch of people. And it's not STEM. So if you are thinking about doing English history, English lit, English language history, art, so, French, in A-level you get to read some wonderful French writers. Just do it. Just have faith, the world's going to change a lot in the next 10 years. Without sort of saying what I believe religiously or philosophically, it can't be the case that there's a whole bunch of people who are here with these incredible capacities, with these gifts, who are just all here by mistake, and really we all have to go and do maths now. Maths, well, thank God for maths, but but we're not all mathematicians. Maths obviously is one of the things that AI does very, very well. But so just sign up for, look, I challenge you. And if it doesn't work, you can have your money back. Not really. English history art, English history psychology, English, biology, just chuck it in there. Look, what that's the only other point I wanted to make. And then, God, if you've got this far, bless you. But look, personal development, I don't know if we're meant to link that to education and we're all just meant to be like economic bots now. Oh God, you can't link personal development and education. Well, you obviously can. It's just if there's so much anxiety about the future that you can only make economic decisions, which I think let's believe that that's not going to be the case. And with AI being so disruptive, I don't think anyone really knows. So let's not do it. Let's just do what, according to your soul, you actually are good at. So when you look at sort of English literature now, which now is, I guess, my main subject, and you look at, there's this novel by Ian McEwan, and there's the temple, I'm thinking of Atonement now, if you've read it, and what does the temple symbolise? The interpretive skill that's involved in there is considerable, and you have to think about, what does this family stand for, and they're not religious at all, and they've got a lot of problems, and the parents aren't very present. The young daughter Bryony, she makes a terrible story up, which she kind of mostly believes about somebody, and all of this happens around the temple, the disused and the disowned temple, standing in the middle of this kind of like English country house type, woody type gardens, and it's sort of like, what does that mean? You put it in ChatGPT. I'm not going to tell you now. Not really. That's a joke. Irony as well. Isn't that what partly? I'm selling it to you now. Isn't that partly it? So So what was I saying, Brian? ChatGPT. So, and then, but let me tell you something else. So, what did you dream about last night? Look, I know this isn't an economic argument. Forget about that. What did you dream about last night? So, I'll tell you something. Is this oversharing? I dreamt that Nick Nolte, if you're old enough to remember who he is, was over here, and I basically rugby tackled him. I smashed him down and rugby tackled him to the floor. What the hell was that about? I could tell you what I think it was about, and it obviously the interpretation I give to that fits in with my understanding of what my own sort of like developmental process is in my own life. Shall I tell you? If anyone gets this far, put in the comments and I'll tell you. My daughter watches all those YouTube videos. Whether you have to put things in the comments, like and subscribe. And I'll give you one more. My dad, God love you, Dad, passed away. Why is the most prominent memory of my dad the one where he took us to Brighton for, I think, my 13th or 14th birthday, and we went mad in the arcades playing like Gauntlet, Super Sprint, all the classic arcade games of the 80s. Why is my dad the figure there who I mostly remember him in Brighton? Such a generous day where he was just throwing 10p's at us. He took us all down there. I know that's a lot. You know, he had a very difficult job at the time. And these three things, you know, the temple in Atonement, the Nick Nolte dream, my dad in Brighton. Which A-level subject do you need to be able to understand your life? I'll give you a clue, and I'm completely biased, because obviously, you know, that's why students take psychology. Do you know that? Like, obviously, a bit of trouble in the teens or things aren't going too well. First example of depression, anxiety, that happened to me in my teens as well. That's why I took psychology, and there was a bunch of us doing it like that, because we wanted to understand ourselves. Literature, with a good teacher, very, very useful for that purpose. So I think those, I did them in a different order now, but this is what we need when AI is even more prevalent than it is now. You know, personal development angle, and the fact that these are, you know, skills that are very, very useful, and, you know, your encounter with the great minds is something that could be very, very profitable to you. So that's really what I wanted to say. You know, if anyone gets anything out of this, or for some reason you found this video and you talked to your mum and you said, I am going to do art and literature, let's just have faith that the post-AI world, look, to be honest, if anyone young is watching this, we actually, if you've got a feeling like we probably don't really know what the world will be like in 25 years, we don't. So put yourself down for art, history, French, psychology, literature, history. Let the soul breathe. Let's give ourselves a break. Let's be who we are, and just have faith that the economics and society we need to be ourselves will exist in the future.